Fool's Rockshelter name came because we started on April Fool's. And Mrs. wisely insisted that we not put her name on it because that might tip people off as to where it was prematurely. What happened here was this big rock fell off the face of this cliff and lodged itself right here. And over thousands of years, material has washed over the edge of the cliff and out through here, eroding this rock shelter out, and it's piled up here because of this big rock. And then the people who lived here would leave scattered artifacts around, and it would get covered by a thin layer of material, and then another group would camp here, and it built up over thousands of years. And down here, what you're looking at in the excavation is a hearth. That was a living surface at one time. We think about 2,500 years ago, so close to that. And you can see in the sidewall how there's laminations. Each of those laminations is a big rain event that covered up what might have been on the surface here at that time. We don't know how deep this goes or how old it's going to be. That's all the fun. We're going to find out. That bank right there with all those laminations in it is the most important part of this rock shelter because it contains biobotanical information of the environmental past.
Explain that a little bit.
There's plant remains and pollen in those sealed laminations. They're secure. We know they're secure. They're not contaminated. An analyst will be able to draw lots of information out of those pollen about the plants that were thriving at the time, which says a lot about the amount of rain, how dry it was, how wet it was, the conditions that these people were living in. The laminations have also a lot of charcoal in them, and so we'll be able to securely date those laminations. So we get a time period for that weather condition. The artifacts that are also in those levels, many of them are time diagnostic. And so we can say that this hearth right here is surrounded by artifacts that are called Frio points. So that those are the people, we know them as the Frio people because there's no written information about them. And we'll be able to say that those people lived here at this time, and these were the conditions that they lived under.
So we're, what time period are we at now at this level?
I'd have to get the book out, but I think
Somewhere
it's
around the time of Christ.
Yeah.
Plus minus 500 years.
Everything else below this is going to be before Christ.
Okay.
And we're hoping it goes way on down and goes back to the earliest human occupations in America.
Have you found any tools to speak
yes,
of?
we've got lots of tools. Let's go look at them.
Okay.
Well, this dark point, even though we cannot directly date it, other examples typologically similar to it or exact have been found in secure archaeological deposits with material that could be radiocarbon dated. And so over a period of time and from different excavations, this point type has been dated to 8,000 years ago. And so
Does it have a value?
monetary value. Yeah, they all do. I mean, you can imagine something 8,000 years old is going to have value. You could take this to an artifact show and probably get $50 for it. Now this is the specimen of obsidian we talked about. Very rare to find that in an excavation.
How far away did that come from, possibly?
Dr. Hester, who's pretty experienced with this stuff, thinks it came from the Yellowstone.
What?
Yeah. Well, obsidian is not found naturally in Texas. So anytime you find obsidian in an excavation in Texas, it means it came from a long ways off. And that's a long ways for a time period when there was only foot travel. It's the same thing as this flint from around here, but it's glass, so it flakes really easily. And it's a good cutting material, besides being very beautiful. So I'm sure it was prized by the peoples here in South Texas for both reasons. This specimen right here, when it came out, all of us involved in this excavation looked at each other And your mother's name came up immediately because she was telling us how wonderful things were going to come out of this shelter. And we've dug these things before, you know, and there are a lot of beat up tools, a lot of things people wouldn't recognize as artifacts. Your mother seemed to float on air when she talked about this rock shelter and the wonderful things we were going to find here. And when this came out, we all looked at each other and thought, this one, he knew a lot more than we did about what was going to happen here.
You can spot them, huh?
Yeah, well, she was just sure that the place was special, and it is very special. This is the latest artifact. Your brother actually found this and didn't know it. As he was watching us dig, he was leaning against one of the upper units and just messed around with his finger, and he exposed some bone. Well, later we looked at that bone, and it's actually a sawn piece of bone that was used for a knife handle. I don't know if you can see the striations of the saw there. And then that is a drilled hole. It was drilled with a metal drill because you can tell because it's so circular. And this is mid 1800s. So this represents, we're sure, the last people who lived in this. And this may be, it could be that it was a bone handle from some of the later Indian groups that were raiding the European settlers in this country. This was a good hideout for them. So, I don't think your brother knows that yet.
I'm not going to tell him.
Well, I'm going to tell him. And we know how old these type of dart points are, so we can put an age on that trade into Texas. And it matches up pretty good with a culture called, a time period called woodlands in the Midwest. What were they called? Hopewell? The woodlands?
Yeah.
Anyways, they're known to have brought obsidian out of Wyoming, and then this kind of ties that to them. A trade network with the Frio peoples of South Texas and the woodlands cultures of the Midwest. All right, we got, right here is a early corner notch type point that we know is around 8,000 years old. This point was found down by the old cemetery at the other corner of the property, on the surface.
On the surface.
Yes. This is a Frio point, which these are what we're finding the most of right now. All right, they're about 2,000 years old, 2,500 years old. There's more samples of them. That they got the little fish-tailed look to them. And another one.
Used for what?
These are spear points used with the atlatl.
With these two?
Mm-hmm. All three of these. This is another type of spear point that's called a pedernales. It's the most common point type in Texas.
Now, how are you able to determine that as opposed to just being a flat rock?
Well, you got to look at a lot of chipped rock. That's how. And because this specimen here is beat up, and you just have to know what you're looking at. Have handled lots of them to be able to recognize attributes that would classify it. This is a common triangular point. It was found in the excavation at an upper level, and we thought at first it might be a very early point, but looking at the attributes, the flaking attributes of it, it's not. And a triangular artifact is a very common shape used throughout history. So we were assuming that it's associated with the Frio peoples. Now this would have been another archaic dart point. We could call it a Marshall point. And it's about the same age. Then we have...
Now, what age is that?
About the same age, 2,000 years ago,
Okay.
generally. Here we have what's called a transitional archaic point. This was made during a time when things were transitioning from the atlatl to the bow and arrow in South Texas. The points the spear points began to get smaller and smaller and smaller because, I mean, can you imagine shooting that on a little arrow? You know, it just wasn't going to work. And then finally, we have this type of point, which is called a Perdiz point, and it's a true arrow point. It'll be 1,000 years or younger, shall we say. And these were the last peoples that we know of, last prehistoric peoples that we know of that used this rock shelter, these type of points. We think there's good evidence that the Clovis people, the first whose culture we can identify, were actually from Western Europe.
Yeah. No, why are they called Clovis?
Because their dark points were first exposed in an excavation near Clovis, New Mexico. These are Clovis era artifacts. Clovis is the earliest identifiable culture in North America. These are about 12,000 years old. And Jeff found them in the Colorado River, right?
Yeah, washed out on gravel.
Near LaGrange, Texas. This was probably a finished Clovis spear point. This was a preform. It was roughed in and never finished yet. But these were probably left in a cache, buried cache on a campsite, and then washed out eventually into the river. After 12,000 years, that's a lot of erosion, you know. And the people are going to be camping fairly near the water, so this is not uncommon for this to have happened over that time period.
So Columbus wasn't the first person here in the United States?
No, I'm afraid not, but at no fault to him, or no intention to him, he introduced diseases which wiped out this country. When the next Europeans came, there weren't very many people living here, and they assumed, and we've all assumed for a long time, that there was a sparse population, but it wasn't. During the time when European contact with Native Americans, the local peoples who were living here called themselves the Tonkawa, and along the coast, the Karankawa. Those are the only names we have. Later tribes were driven through the Seminoles, and you'll see a lot of geographical areas around South Texas with Indian names, and they're generally going to be tribes that were driven through from the east by the settlers' expansion.
How'd you get interested in this?
When I bought the ranch in Frio County, we started finding arrowheads about the time that I also got on the internet. And there was just Googles of information on archaeology, including two archaeological groups, the Southern Texas Archaeological Society and the Texas Archaeological Society, who both welcomed me in and taught me lots of stuff.
How long have you been doing this?
8 years.
Now I've been working on this site up here with Clint McKenzie, who is a primary investigator. He's an archaeologist. He used to be the San Antonio city archaeologist. Okay. We're learning a lot here. It's a potential for being one of the biggest sites in Texas, and we're going to see how that works out.
So Joe, what are you recording there?
I measured where the rock fall is sitting within the unit, so that at a point in the future we can see that rock fall and the associated rocks were interfering in this unit here.
And now where's it gonna go from here? Who's gonna interpret that?
The PI is going to do it.
PI standing for?
Principal investigator.
Okay.
The Clint McKenzie.
Yeah, a reasonable guess on my part, and this is just a guess, there would be an article published in the La Tierra, it's the journal of the STAA, possibly the Bulletin of the Texas Archaeological Society. That'd be a good outlet for publication. It'd also make a good master's thesis project for someone. And there's almost no limit to the amount of analysis that can be done. Main thing is to get it out there in the literature so people can take a look at it. Well, I work for the Texas Archaeological Research Lab at the University of Texas, and I assign all the site numbers and maintain the maps and GIS. And when David sent this site in to get it registered, I emailed him back, said it looks like a spectacular site. Invited me to come down and take a look. So
So this is your first time out here?
first time.
Check me.
Each excavator has a color, and that helps make sure when we screen it that we have all of the material from the same level, the same unit, the same level, so that it doesn't get mixed during the screening process and bagging process. At our quarterly meeting last week, we had a speaker there that talked about rhabdotas as a food source. He had done extensive work on this, collecting the meat from the rhabdota and sending it to a lab to have it analyzed as a food source. You know, how much, what percent of fat, how many calories it would generate, and carbohydrates, and you know, the various constituents of the rhabdota meat. And one of the questions was always, how do you get the rhabdota, the meat, out of that little shell? Well, they'd done some work on that too, and found that if you dropped them in a pot of water, turned the heat on, when the water got to about 110 degrees, they crawled out of their shells. And it was just a matter of taking like a toothpick or anything and flicking them. You could flick them out as fast as you could grab them. And so, I don't know, you know, it's a possibility maybe it was a food source. Something personally I'd always doubted until I heard that presentation. Now I have to allow that, well, maybe, just maybe.
Is that right?
Draw me a line.
All right, so educate the ignorant here. Why are you going from the point right underneath Joe's feet instead of further down where you're standing?
Well, the ultimate idea of this extension of this unit is to come down on top of this that I've been standing on. And this is a fairly large hearth feature, a big campfire. And so the idea is to open all this up, bring it straight down on top so we get a look at this in plan view. So we'll have the shape and size, dimensions, what have you. And then I don't know what their plans are, but my guess is that it'll be cut in half, bisected, and then half of the rocks will be plucked out and the dirt underneath them will be sampled, bagged up, because the dirt underneath them is pretty much sealed in place, so it should be pretty much exactly the surface that the Native Americans left.
Why this is so important?
I would say the preservation is, and just from being out here for a couple hours, the preservation is spectacular.
Compared to most hill countryside.
Yeah, and the deposition, most rock shelters in this limestone environment just plainly do not have this kind of good stratification. We don't have this much deposition to begin with. We mostly have a solid limestone floor and a talus slope alluvium that's probably all mixed heck and back.
Two of them, one for now and one for
Whereas this is pretty good, pretty well stratified deposit. Spectacular profile. You can see individual depositional episodes, probably unique flood packages that could be related to geology. If we were to get a good geomorphologist out here, take a look at it, get some good relative dating out of that, and have some feel for what zones are intact living surfaces and which are mixed. The it could conceivably even answer some geomorphological questions in and of itself without the archaeology. So, yeah,
For instance,
well, now you're kind of getting out of my depth of expertise, but in terms of what are called altitherms, dry intervals versus wet periods,
Large mesoc intervals.
mesoc intervals, xeric intervals. Conceivably, someone could, we could take a column sample of this sediment in real fine increments, say 5 centimeters, or even do it with these natural strata, and do some microbotanical sort of things,
Look at the doty.
because there's a chance that perhaps pollen's preserved in there, and those are real sensitive to climate, pollen types. All kinds of questions you could answer with a site like this if you've got
Jonathan,
the time.
you run across this kind of rhabdody over here?
Yeah,
Did you? All up in here? Okay.
real dense. Real dense.
That's pretty heavy there.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a pretty unique site.
hey, what do you got there?
We found 10 or 15 other pieces. Now this is a flint flake. This is the original outside covering of the flint nodule that we call cortex. It's a mineralization over thousands or millions of years, I guess, millions of years. The Indian picked up this flint nodule, which may have been as big as, say, a turtle, and began hitting it with another rock.
Yeah, right here.
Right here,
You want me to leave it like
Yeah.
that? Without moving?
just see there's
Well,
a slight
when David
bulb.
gets through yapping
That's
about
what we
it,
call the
we'll
bulb of
get Joe
percussion,
here.
and
Go
that
ahead.
tells us that this is where the Indian struck
Yeah.
to initiate the fractures to get this flake off.
No, we've got that light gravel striating the entire unit, or one portion of the unit, or whatever it is. But they're going to be looking for that information when we get through. So while we're down here digging, we'll constantly be talking to each other back and forth about these little gravel layers, the charcoal striations, if they're occurring more towards us here in the center, or if they get steeper or heavier in the farther edges, anything to help define the stratigraphy that we're actually working through in the unit level.
So how do you mark like this dirt to know which time period we're dealing with?
We can determine a lot about time periods only based on what we know, like he was talking about finding a Marcos point. Well, after a while, you find certain kind of points all over the place, and some of them are connected with things you can date, like charcoal. And then you know that this point was at this time period, and then every time you find a Marcos, and it falls, you can pretty much say, okay, now we're talking about that time period. And then when you find this kind of dirt and that kind of time period, then you kind of like say, okay, around late Archaic, where these arrow points are normally found, in this layer with this dirt, this is what was going on. Okay? It's very logical, but they have a way of documentation is really, really important in archaeology. It's extremely important because the authenticity and appropriateness of your interpretation is only based on how accurate your data is. So the bags are all like one particular square, at one particular level, at a depth, so many, we used to do it in inches, now we do it in centimeters. I remember the days of the inches. Centimeters. And then who took it. And then they have a level sheet where they put all this kind of information on there that goes with these bags. And they all go back to the lab. Because even though you spend hours digging here, you spend many, 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 many hours in the lab, having personnel, very dedicated individuals and volunteers a lot of times, going through and washing things and looking at them and writing them up and doing all the statistics here to be looked at later by the archaeologists. It's very time consuming, and there's a lot of patience is required if you want to come up with a document that's very accurate.
The tunnels that you see back into the limestone are solution cavities where rainwater gathering on the surface would run down through the limestone and wash out into here. At one time, maybe before this rock that's in front of the cave fell, this was the surface of this cave. And it's eroded down because of that rainwater over the thousands of years to what we see now. Each and every heavy rain event that which water flowed out of these tunnels washed deposits down on the living surface here and sealed those surfaces in. And we have these inflow tunnels and that big rock to thank for these secure archaeological deposits.
So I was lucky enough to tie in with Colonel Tom Kelly, who is a kind of an icon of STAA. He taught me how to dig properly, how to set up my sites, and really stayed on me about doing it right. And then I got to help edit and do the photo retouch and photos of Dan Davis's book, Artifacts of the Prehistoric Indians, Texas Indians. It's about a 600-page book. So that all kind of came together for me due to Dan Davis and Colonel Tom Kelly.
So tell me the significance of this. Is this like an important find, a mediocre find?
Oh, this site, as far as artifacts that are coming out of it, excluding the obsidian, these are ordinary artifacts that we would find at any excavation. What's special about this site is that the biobotanical information is sealed in so well. When this site is finally published, which may take a few years, it will be referred to in every archaeological report from now on. This will be the most important site as far as environmental information in Central and South Texas.